Men is an art house horror suspense film written and directed by Alex Garland. And even though I enjoyed his two previous films, Ex Machina and Annihilation, more than Men, it's a film I still highly appreciated for both its aesthetic style and its bold artistic ambitions that made it such an interesting discussion piece. In this video, I'm going to do my best to interpret what I believe Alex Garland's artistic intentions were in regard to the imagery that are represented during key moments in the film, especially in regards to the ending that, in a drastic turn of events, contains some of the most unpredictably bizarre imagery that I've seen in a contemporary horror film. It's an ending that makes it its mission to ensure that everyone walks away from the film scratching their heads. It's a highly interpretive film that leaves plenty of intentional ambiguities regarding its narrative and symbolism. It leaves a lot of unanswered questions for the audience, such as, why did all the men look the same, and why didn't anybody remark on this fact? What were those ancient stone carvings throughout the film, and what was their significance to the plot and characters? And finally, I'm sure everybody was wondering, what the fuck was up with that ending? Before I begin, if you want to check out my spoiler-free review for Men, I'll post that in the description box below and at the end of this video. So usually when starting an analysis, I like to research anything containing thoughts and information coming directly from the artists themselves. And I was able to find an interview with Alex Garland giving what I believe to be some crucial information regarding the film. In regards to the stone carvings in the film, he states, one is called the Green Man and one is called Sheila Gig. And they're bits of imagery that you find in many churches, but they predate medieval times and they're all over Europe, in fact stretch beyond Europe. And they're interesting because they're powerful bits of iconography and they provoke a response in one form or another. So after reading this, I did a dive of my own into what the Green Man and Sheila Gigs represented throughout the course of history. And from what I've learned about the Green Man is that it's a pre-Christian myth that was able to find a way to be incorporated into the carvings of churches all throughout Europe. What it meant to people was subjective, but generally speaking, it was a figure that was meant to represent the annual revival of spring. Symbolically, he represented many things, but mostly death and rebirth. And in regards to the Green Man's physical appearance, he's known to appear in many different forms, with the three most common ones being the foliate head, completely covered in green leaves, the discouraging head, which spews vegetation from its mouth, and the bloodsucker head that sprouts vegetation from all facial orifices. And once I learned this vital piece of information, it seemed like everything began to fall in place. To me, it helped explain many different aspects of this film. It helped explain the film's emphasis on nature, which I'd like to also add contains biblical imagery. And I just loved how Garland utilizes pagan and biblical imagery in this film, because to me, it kind of blurs the dividing line between the two in the sense that all religions take from previous ones. But it also helped explain the supernatural aspect of the film, and it also not only helped explain why the villain had a face covered in leaves, but symbolically it helped explain the absolute bonkers of an ending where we see the villain give birth to himself over and over and over again. But what about the Sheila Gig? There's two different stone carvings, so where does that come into play? Sheila Gigs are ancient carvings that demonstrate a woman with an exaggerated vulva, and much like the Green Man, are found in churches all across Europe. Its symbolic meaning is disputed, but the more contemporary belief is that she represents a celebration of fertility. So, my interpretation of the bizarre body horror imagery that we get in the final 10 minutes of the film is that we're witnessing a combination of both ancient deities, the Green Man and the Sheila Gig. In order to be reborn, you need a vessel. Sheila Gig gives the Green Man that vessel, which is why we get the reoccurring contradictory imagery of an impregnated man giving birth to himself through a vaginal canal. And I think there are many different intentions behind this imagery as well. For one, I think he wanted to show the necessity of both sexes for procreation and the irony behind that. The irony in the sense that despite how misogynistic and patriarchal societies have been since the beginning of time, men have always relied on the fertility of women to continue their patriarchal cycle. Which is why despite their repeated births, it's always a man due to their societal dominance. I also think that Garland wanted to demonstrate a disturbing look at a generational timeline. Each man looks the same despite each birth because through the generations, the type of toxic traits that influence an imbalanced society and relationships with women still remain. That's why the last man we see is her dead ex-husband. It's a generational representation of how we get to a horribly abusive and selfish man like him in modern day. He also has the same severed hand and broken leg inflicted upon him from his fall. Except this time, these wounds were physically inflicted by her. To me, this represents how she has always felt some guilt for his death, as if she bears some of the responsibility for it. She slightly admits to feeling guilty while talking to the priest until he takes it too far and basically tells her that the entire thing is her fault for not allowing him to apologize for punching her in the face. But the point is that rebirth is not only a theme of the Green Man, but it's a theme of her character as well. In this final scene where she asks him what he wants, he says, "I want you to love me." And this gave her confirmation that what he sought after in their relationship wasn't love and companionship. It was control and ownership. And she was then able to liberate herself from her guilt, which is symbolically represented in the imagery of her killing him with a knife. But control and ownership are both commonly assessed as toxic masculine traits that has been observed in the vast majority of societies and all the major religions and religious institutions. This theme is artfully expressed in a scene that I like to call the dandelion scene, which is, without a doubt, my favorite scene in the film. Stylistically, it's incredibly effective with not only its immersive aesthetic style regarding the use of sound and slow motion and lighting, but it also expresses the theme of control and ownership incredibly well. The most primal version of all the men she encounters blows a white dandelion in her face. We see one of the seeds travel to her mouth as she swallows it, and she then seems to be under an entranced hypnosis type state where she finds it incredibly difficult to run away. It's as if her conscious and subconscious switched places. But how did this happen, and why the choice of dandelions? Well, traditionally, the act of blowing off all the dandelions with one breath meant that the one you love will love you back. So what we see in this scene is a demonstration of the inner male desire for control through the hypnosis of the dandelion, and the dandelion seed that enters her body represents the male desire to impregnate and expand their lineage. But even though she is entranced, her subconscious is able to fight hard enough to walk back into the house. And what I love about the editing style of the scene is that as she walks away, it cuts back and forth of imagery of what I interpret as her conscious desires. It's showing us that she wants to desperately escape the situation, but the dreamlike state she's in just won't allow her. We then get a shot of his hand as he reaches out to her in what seems to be in a more soft and romantic way. I interpreted this scene as the villainous entity asking her for her hand in marriage. And she's so entranced that she also reaches out and holds his hand, but he then violently grabs her arm, which both symbolically and literally demonstrates that ownership was the true intention of the marriage proposal, rather than love and companionship. For that reason, she's able to snap out of it and stab his arm, as we get a slow motion scene of him slowly pulling away as the knife splits his arm right down the middle, which is obviously mimicking her ex-husband's wound. But the concept of marriage is a product of patriarchal traditions and religious ideas in the sense that they were designed to mostly benefit men, where they would possess both control and ownership of a woman. Not saying that's fully how it is now, but the practice itself stems from a patriarchal design that encourages entitled and selfish behavior, which is why someone like her ex-husband will threaten suicide as a disgusting manipulative tactic just to avoid divorce. But now I'd like to read another excerpt from the Alex Garland interview regarding another aspect of the film. In regards to Rory Kinnear playing several different characters, he states, "So you have one character playing all these roles, and it's obviously not arbitrary. It's obviously a decision. So one question might be, does Harper see all the men as the same? Because neither Harper nor the film ever remark on it, ever. Only the viewer is left to remark on it. So is it that Harper sees all men as the same, whilst they are in fact different, or is it all men are the same and she does not see that? There are two questions that sound very similar but have completely different inferences." So basically, in the film's world, is it a false perspective that all the men looked the same, or is it actually reflecting reality? I mean, Garland intentionally crafts it in a way where we may not ever get a solid answer, but if I had to lean on one side, I'd say that they all look the same, but she doesn't see it. Reason being, as Garland mentioned, she never remarks on it a single time, which to me doesn't really make much sense. Also, in her attempted escape, she stops to help Jeffrey, which to me could only be explained by the fact that he must have looked completely different than how we, the audience, are perceiving him. But why does the audience see them all as the same? What's the thematic purpose? Well, from the Green Man standpoint, it could be because he represents rebirth and oneness, therefore naturally would manifest as the same man but in different forms. All the forms of men in the film are a product of some type of toxic trait. The three characters that stood out to me were the priest, who represses his sexuality due to his sense of self-righteousness, but all that does is result in unhealthy pent-up sexual desires that releases itself in even worse ways that we observe in the third act. The adolescent deals with rejection in an entitled and insulting way by continuing to insist and calling her a stupid bitch as he walks away. This demonstrates the way that some adolescents raised under religious ideology view women as objects that they're entitled to. Jeffrey, to me, kind of gives me nice guy vibes. Somebody who feels entitled to your body and love just because they're polite to you. Also usually somebody who snaps and shows their true colors once they're rejected. But pretty much every form of man here, except for maybe Jeffrey, exhibits gaslighting behavior. Which basically just means they all made it seem like her concerns are just a product of her own issues and mistakes that she needs to deal with. Which is and has been a nightmarish reality that women throughout history have had to deal with due to the societal imbalance between men and women. The final thing I thought I'd touch on briefly is the biblical imagery of the apple tree. I know that originally it's actually a pomegranate, which is probably why Alex Garland included a scene of Jeffrey solving one of his crossword puzzles and the word is pomegranate. But why specifically did Garland include this biblical piece of imagery? Well, if I had to take a guess, it would have to be because the story of Adam and Eve represents the fall of man because of a woman's wrongdoings. It's a story that for thousands of years has embedded a negative idea about women that planted the seed of misogyny, allowing patriarchal societies to flourish. And one of the first scenes in the film before she meets anybody is her noticing the tree, grabbing an apple, and taking a bite out of it, recreating the Adam and Eve motif. But what significance does this have with the story and characters? I have a wild and perhaps unsubstantiated idea I'm willing to throw out there, and it's that perhaps nature and the religious mythical idea of nature is punishing her in a way for expressing her freedom to take the fruit without permission. She took something from nature and it wants something back in return. I don't know, I'm just throwing something out there. Maybe it doesn't serve as anything deeper than just a biblical allusion, but I'd love to hear what everyone has to say about this and really about the entire film in general. Again, it's an incredibly interpretive piece of filmmaking, so I wouldn't be surprised to read some opinions that are wildly different from mine. And again, I'd love to hear everybody else's interpretations and also your thoughts on my interpretation. And also just what do you think of Alex Garland in general? Do you like his previous films? Where exactly would you rank men amongst his entire filmography? But all in all, if you really enjoyed what I had to say about the film, please make sure to give this video a like and share it amongst your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be updated on more film-related content.